Hi, it's Louise from Sincerely Louise, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to sew up your phone cozy. Just like with the knitting tutorials in First Time Knits, there are also sewing up ones. So for each project there'll be a bit of sewing up and I'm going to be showing you how to do it. With your phone cozy you're going to learn how to sew up using backstitch and then decorate it. So for it you'll just need your phone cozy and then your sewing up materials such as felt, sewing needles and cotton. I've just finished knitting this long rectangular piece of fabric which I'm going to turn into the cozy. So I've just cast off, and what you'll see is that my cast on tail, which was created by the slip knot at the beginning, and my cast off tail are both on the left of the piece. In First Time Knits, I recommended leaving a 60cm or 24-inch tail to sew up with, but if you didn't, don't worry too much. With backstitch, we're going to be sewing up the sides of the work, so the side seams there. And if you think the phone cozy looks slightly too wide for your phone, it's not, because we're going to lose a bit of each side once we've sewn it up. So let's transform this piece of knitting into a phone cozy. Start by folding it together, so taking your cast off edge and folding it up to the cast on one, so both edges meet. The two yarn tails will also meet. What you'll be sewing up is that folded edge, so you want to make sure it's lined up properly. You can use pins to help. To sew up you'll need a darning needle. I like to use plastic ones, but you can use metal ones as well. Thread the end of your cast off tail through the darning needle, ready to sew up. For example purposes, I'm going to use a contrast colour to sew up. So I'm cutting my yarn tail. Don't do this for your project. I've cut a new length of 60cm yarn in a contrast orange. So if you didn't leave enough yarn to sew up, just cut a new length of yarn that's the same colour as your project. Using a tape measure, measure 2 cm away from the edge. And then measure 1 cm from the side. This is where you want to push the yarn and needle through. From the back of the work, push your yarn and needle 2 cm from the edge and 1 cm from the side. Your yarn will most probably be attached to the knitting as you're using that cast off edge tail, but if you're using a new piece of yarn like me, you'll leave an extra tail. You don't want to pull that too tightly as you'll lose the tail, so you want to leave a 10 cm or 4-inch tail when sewing up. Now that the yarn and needle have been pulled out of the work, measure 2 cm back to the edge and push the yarn and needle through it, so we're kind of going back on ourselves. Pull the yarn and needle so they go through both pieces of knitting. If you're using a new piece of yarn, be careful not to pull it too tightly as you'll lose the tail. Now you want to measure 4 cm to the fold, so measure 4 cm along the work towards the fold and push the yarn and needles through the knitting at this point, so push it through both pieces of knitting and pull it out the other side. Then you need to measure 2 cm back on itself, so we're going back to that original point we pushed the needle through, and then once again push it through the knitting and out the other side, so you can see our stitches starting to form. At this point you want to measure 4 cm to the fold, so we're repeating those steps again. We're measuring 4 cm to the fold, pushing the needle through the work, and then measuring 2 cm back on ourselves and pushing the needle through again. And that's what creates the backstitch. Once again measure 4 cm towards the fold, and then 2 cm back, pushing the needle through. Remember to stay 1 cm in from the edge at all times, so you sew it up in a straight line. You can always pin the work to help keep it in place when sewing it up. Continue doing the backstitch all the way along the phone cozy. So repeating that process of 4 cm to the fold and then 2 cm back. Keep working the back stitch to the fold of the knitting, and you'll find, like with knitting, the more you do it, the quicker you'll get. As you're sewing up using the same colour yarn as you're knitting, you won't see the stitching as much, but because I'm using this contrast colour to show you what I'm doing, you're seeing it more than usual. So I'm reaching towards the edge of the fold, so I've gone 4 centimetres towards it, 2 centimetres back, and then right to the edge of it. So it's a bit less than 4 centimetres, but I need to sew it all up. Then I'm just going to go 2 centimetres back on myself, and then back to the end of the fold, just to secure my yarn. So now you'll see I've sewn up one side of my phone cosy using backstitch. Don't cut the yarn tail at this point, just pull it out of the needle and we'll weave it in later. For your next piece of sewing up, you won't have the cast off tail to use, so cut a new length of 60cm or 24-inch yarn that's the same colour as your phone cosy. Then turn the cosy around so the edges are facing towards the right. Repeat the sewing instructions for this side of the cosy, so pushing the needle and yarn 2 centimetres from the edge and 1 centimetre through the side, pushing it from the back and through both pieces of the knitting. Leave a tail of around 10 centimetres or 4 inches to weave in later. Then measure 2 centimetres back towards the edge of the work and push the needle and yarn through. Be careful not to pull it too tightly and lose the tail of yarn. Then measure 4 centimetres towards the fold and push the yarn and needles through. This time you can pull it tightly because that will secure the stitches. Measure 2 centimetres back and push the needle and yarn through there. Then repeat the whole process to the fold of the cosy. Remember to stay 1 centimetre in from the side. I've just finished sewing up the other side of my phone cosy, and again I haven't cut the end of the yarn, I've just left it there to weave in. In total you'll have 4 ends to weave in, and because we've sewn up using backstitch, we can weave them into the side seams. Start by threading one of those loose ends through the darning needle, and then find one of the side seams to weave into. Push the needle and yarn through the first stitch on the side seam, so you're pushing it from behind and through that stitch. Then find the stitch above it and do the same, so keep pushing the needle through the stitch on the side seam and then up to the next one and push it through and out. Unlike backstitch, you only need to go through one piece of the knitting, you don't need to go through both. Once you feel you've weaved the yarn through enough stitches, just trim it down and it will be nice and secure. Then thread your next loose end through the darning needle and weave that into the seam closest to it. Repeat those steps of pushing it through the stitch from the back to the front and out, and then from the back to the front of the stitch above it. Keep weaving in until you feel that the loose end is secure, and then trim it down. If you have a really long loose end, you could always trim it down to 10 to 20 centimetres, that's 4 to 8 inches, before weaving it in, as this will make it slightly easier. After you finish knitting or sewing up, you don't want to trim those ends down too short, because that will make them harder to weave in. So you'll see my 2 tails here are slightly shorter than my others that I weaved in, so it's going to be a bit tougher. Start weaving in where that tail is, so you don't have to weave in at the beginning or end of the stitching. you can start weaving in at any point of the knitting where that tail starts. I've weaved into a few stitches here, but not quite as many as my tail's quite short. The same goes for this tail on the other side. It's really short, so it's quite fiddly to weave in. You'll see that my weaved in stitches are quite obvious, but that's because I'm using a contrast colour, so it shows a lot more. Because we're weaving into the seam, you won't see any of this at all. I've just finished weaving in the tails I used to sew up the work, but I've also got my cast off and cast on tails to weave in too. You should only have a cast on tail, as you'll have used the cast off tail to sew up your work. I've left one of these tails really short, so it'll be tough to weave in. It can be tempting just to trim it all the way down, but you need to weave it in to make sure it's secure. Use the same method of pushing it through the stitches on the side of the seams to weave it in. You won't notice it as much as it's the same colour as my knitting project. Finally, I want to weave that last tail into the side of my knitting. And I'm weaving it into the same stitches that I wove my last piece into. That's absolutely fine to do, as it's going to be hidden in that side seam anyway. I've just finished weaving in all my loose ends. It's not the most exciting thing with your knitting project, but it is something you have to do to finish it off. Now that I've sewn up my phone cosy and it's all finished, I get to turn it inside out. And that's one of my favourite parts of this project, turning that piece inside out and seeing how it looks. You may want to pull it around a little bit just to give it its shape, so you want it to have that rectangular shape of a phone cosy. You can see my stitching along the cosy quite clearly because I sewed it up in a different colour, but on the original one, which I sewed up using the pink, you can't see it at all, so that's why you need to use the same colour as your yarn to sew up your project. Now all I need to do is decorate it. If you'd like your cosy to be secure at the top and to stop your phone from falling out, you can add a bow to it. Here's one I made earlier that has the bow attached to it. It's slightly smaller than the one I've just made, as it was for a different phone. Cut a 60cm or 24-inch length of yarn. It can be the same colour as your phone cosy, or you could pick a different one if you like. Sew it through the centre of one of the open edges. Pull the needle out, so now you'll have two pieces of yarn coming from that centre. Make sure they're equal lengths and then tie a double knot. Turn the cosy around and then repeat. So cut another length of 60cm or 24-inch yarn and sew it through the centre of the open edge. Then tie it in a double knot. Check to see if all the yarn lengths are the same, and if they're not, just trim them down so they're all the same size. And then tie them together in a bow. The bow is optional, so you can leave your cosy without one. Now it's time to decorate your phone cosy. I'll be turning mine into the pig, but there are lots of different templates available on the First Time Knits website. Each design has 4 template sheets, which refer to the different cast-on sizes from the book. These are colour-coded to match the size that you cast on with, so if you cast on using the blue size, use the blue template. The phone cosy that you've made should fit the template on the sheet. So I used the blue cast on, my phone cosy fits, and I'm ready to decorate it. The template sheet has an illustration for guidance on placing the templates to the right of it. To decorate your cosy, you just need some basic craft supplies. Here I'm using some black felt for the nostrils and the eyes, and some pink felt for the nose and the ears. You'll also need some sewing needles and some cotton. I'd recommend using the same colour as your felt, but I'm going to be using blue and cream for example purposes, so you can see what I'm doing when I'm sewing mine up. You can use anything to decorate your phone cosy, including colourful pom-poms, felt or yarn, to customise it however you'd like. You could head down to your local craft store to see what goodies they have, or check out my online shopping list. Katie used lots of colourful pom-poms to decorate hers, so you can really do whatever you'd like to make the phone cosy your own. I'm going to be using the pig template today to decorate mine, but you can still watch this tutorial even if you're using a different design or coming up with your own. All the templates for these designs are available on the First Time Knits website. However you decorate yours, make sure you share a picture with me so I can add it to the Project One inspiration page. After you've printed the right template for your phone cosy, you need to cut out the pieces on the right of it. On the left is an illustrated guide of how to place them, so you don't want to cut that out. I'm going to start by cutting out the snout for my pig. Then grab the piece of felt that's the same colour as the snout and place the template over it. Then draw around it. You don't have to be super neat as we're going to be cutting it out in a second. Then take your scissors and cut out the piece of felt. Once I've cut mine out, I like to neaten it up a little bit. Take the snout template and cut out the nostrils from it. Some of the other templates might also feature this, so make sure you cut out all the pieces even if they're within another template. Grab the black felt and place the template over it. You can draw around it, or you can just hold it in place and cut it out. You can use pins to keep it in position too, but as it's such a small piece, I'm just going to cut around it. Then I'm going to neaten it up. And there we have it, one nostril. Then you just need to repeat it for the second. I didn't even cut the second template out, I'm just reusing the first one. Crafty. Once you've cut out your nostrils and positioned them on the snout, you can use the illustration to help you place them. You need to sew them on. Usually I'd use black cotton, but I'm using cream so you can see what I'm doing. Thread the cotton through the needle, then starting at the back of the snout, push the needle and cotton through the snout and nostril. You can pin the nostrils in place to keep them in position, but I'm just going to hold them for now. Like I said before, you can use the illustration for guidance on placing your nostrils, or you can place them wherever you'd like on the snout to give your pig its own personality. Push the needle and cotton back through the nostril and the snout. See, my nostrils got in the way now. I should have pinned it, so I'll just pop it to the side for the moment. Then push the needle and cotton back through the snout and the nostril a few millimetres away from the first stitch. Then push it back through the felt. So what we're making here is a running stitch. So we're going in and out of the work, leaving lines across it. So these won't show up as much when working in the black yarn, but because I'm in white, they look really apparent. You're pushing that needle and yarn through the work, bringing it along the back a little bit, and then back up and through, creating lines on either side of it. So that's what a running stitch is. It's kind of like tacking as well. If you prefer a different sewing technique, you can use that. It's completely up to you. But for new crafters, this is a nice, easy method for sewing up. You can make those lines as big or small as you like. You can make long ones which are quite decorative, or small ones which won't show up as much. Once you've sewn up all the way around the nostril, just pop the needle and yarn back to the wrong side of it. I've stitched all the way around my nostril. If I was using the black, then you wouldn't see it, like on my other finished piece. If you didn't pin your nostrils in place, put the other one on the snout. You can use the same piece of cotton to sew up the other nostril, or if you run out, add a new piece in. Using that same running stitch method, sew the other nostril in place. So there you go, both nostrils are now sewn onto the snout. And now I'm going to cut out my ear and eye templates. Then, using the same colour felt as your templates, draw around the templates and cut them out. I've just cut out all my felt pieces to sew onto my phone cosy. If you're making a different design, make sure you've cut out all of them from that one too. I'm now ready to sew my pieces onto the cosy, using the illustration from the template as a guide. If you want to change your phone cosy's expression, you can try moving around those pieces too. To sew up the snout, I'd usually use cream or a similar colour to the felt, but for example purposes I'm going to use blue so you can see what I'm doing. To start sewing up the snout, push the needle and yarn through the knit and the snout. Only go through one side of the knitting and leave a tail. A few millimetres up, push the needle and yarn through the felt and the knitting back to the place you started, and then repeat. This will secure the stitch. You may want to pin the snout to keep it in place when you sew it up, removing the pins as you get to them. Once that stitch is secure, you're ready to sew all the way around it. To start, I'm sewing over that stitch one more time. When you're sewing the felt onto the cosy, you want to make sure you're only sewing through one side of the knit, so you can pop your hands in the knitting to help guide you when you sew it up. You're going to sew up using a running stitch again, so pushing the needle and yarn through the felt and the knit, out through the back, and then back into it, creating the running stitch like you did with the nostrils. Once again, you can leave the stitches as long or small as you'd like them, and when sewing up using a similar colour to the felt, you won't notice them as much. Sew all the way around the snout using the running stitch. Once you've finished sewing up, push the needle and cotton through the work and then turn the piece inside out. To weave in your end, just push it through the back of the knitting a few times. So it's not visible on the front, but on the back you're just securing that stitch by sewing it through a few times, and then trim it. Then turn the piece around again and you'll have sewn on your snout. With your other tail, you could push it through the knitting and weave it in, or because we secured the stitch earlier, you can just trim it. Now we're ready to sew on our eyes. Once again, you can use the illustration to help guide you where to place them, or you can move them around to really change your pig's expression. I think I'll stick with what I've already designed today. Like with the snout, I'm going to sew the eyes on using the opposite colour to what I'd usually use. So I'm using cream on black, but usually I'd use the same colour as the felt. I'm going to sew the needle and thread from the inside of the cosy because the eyes are a lot closer to the edge of it. So I'm pushing my yarn and needle through and then in and out, so I've got a little tail on the inside, and I'm going over the same stitch again to secure the yarn and thread. Then I'm going to sew all around the outline of the eyes. Using that same running stitch technique, I'm sewing through the knit and the felt, leaving a small stitch, then going back into the knit and coming out again, creating those stitched lines across it. I'm leaving my stitches quite small for the eyes so that you don't see them. Once I've sewn along the bottom of the eye, I'm going to sew along the top because this will keep it extra secure. And I'm keeping that shape from the template so it has that sleepy look. Now the eye's been sewn up, I'll just weave that needle and thread through the back of the knit to secure it. Place the other eye on the cosy and sew it up. You can use the same cotton as before or use a new piece. Once the eyes are sewn on, you may want to push them around to give them a bit more shape. Finally, we're going to sew the ears onto the top of the cosy, using the illustration as a guide. Using a new piece of cotton and yarn, we're going to sew the ears on. As the ears are at the top of the piece, I'm just sewing the needle and thread through the knit a few times to secure it first. So there's another way to secure the yarn and thread when sewing up. Then push the yarn and thread through the felt and back into the knit. And I'm just doing that running stitch once again all the way along the ears to secure them in place. I don't need too many stitches as the ears are quite small. So now I've sewn that up, I'll just weave it in a few times into the inside of the knit to secure it. And then I'll repeat the process for the second ear on the other side of the cosy. So my phone cosy is all sewn up. Thanks to my template sheet and guidance illustration, I'm really happy with how it looks. Obviously you can see the stitching on this one a bit more than the original, but I still think it looks super cute. And there's one thing left to do, which is to put my phone in it and start using it. After you've finished this project, I'd say that you're officially a knitter. You've made a slip knot, cast on, knitted loads of rows, casted off and decorated your phone cosy. So now you're ready to move on to project 2 of first time knits.